Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats. It is with great pleasure that I would like to open with greetings on the occasion of the Symposium on Human Rights Organizations Working in Challenging Environments with Mr. Michael Forst, UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders. It is a special honor to have with us Mr. Forst, real privilege, and this is also a very important timing to have this kind of discussion here at the Leer Jerusalem Institute. My name is Shai, Lavi, and I direct the Institute. Reflecting on today's title for this event, and having in mind the onslaught on human rights organizations and individuals in different countries, including in Israel. Let me begin by congratulating the organizers of this event for what would probably win the prize of the understatement of the year, saying challenging environments, which is, I think, somewhat of an understatement to discuss what may seem in the eyes of many of us as almost a dystopia. So to balance the gloomy mood of what may end up happening in this discussion, we've prepared for you an exhibition on utopia so that you can enjoy some other sides, although as you'll see, the designers of the posters outside were also quite ambivalent about the possibility of utopia in these days, and most of the posters reflect on this ambivalence. By way of introductions and greetings, let me share with you some of the thoughts with which I come to this discussion. And although my background is in law, I know very little about international law, and I've never really studied closely questions of human rights. But let me ask, who will defend the defenders? Do the defenders of human rights organizations and individuals need special protection? If they don't, why they do? If they do, why they don't? The fact that there is a special declaration by the UN General Assembly known as the Declaration on the Rights and Responsibilities of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms seem to suggest that there is a special protection, but in fact, the declaration does not create, even conceptually, a new right that did not previously exist. But these matters cannot be solved simply by words or positive law. Hannah Arendt famously explained that citizenship is the right to have rights. In a paraphrase, we may say that human rights, individuals, and organizations concern the right to have wrongs. That is, the right to name a harm, to state a grievance, to voice a violation of rights in the public sphere. One need not return to Lyotard's Différend to see how the infringements of rights is a first-order harm, while the inability to voice one's grievance is a second-order harm. That is, in important ways, might be more severe than the harm itself. The case is a différent because the harm done to the victims cannot be expressed in a language that can be heard if there are no individuals and organizations to protect human rights. Obviously, courts are one place in which violations of human rights can be heard, but what happens when the courts do not address these wrongs? And even the courts require civil society to raise these questions and voice their protest against violations of rights. It would be thus a mistake to view citizenship merely as a bundle of rights, and mutatis mutandis, it would be a mistake to view the protection of human rights organizations as merely reflecting existing rights, the rights to freedom of organization or freedom of speech. It concerns, in many ways, the right to have rights, or the rights, as I said, to have wrongs recognized. This answers the question, if they don't, why they do. Now let me say 2 words about the other side of this. If they do, why they don't. Or, more accurately, in what way they do or don't. I said earlier that the second-order wrongs are worse than first-order wrongs, but this must be qualified. Not long ago, we had a visitor from Georgia, a very strong-minded leftist activist, who denounced civil society organizations in Georgia, claiming that they are a society, that they form a society within a society. That is, a social network interested primarily in its own, and that there was in-group solidarity that neglected more other possibilities of solidarity with disenfranchised groups. His example was in many ways a telling one. He reported about an uproar among human rights organizations and civil society that took place when a human rights defender was illegally arrested and put behind bars, while so many other innocent victims of the regime remained locked behind the same bars with hardly any protest. I don't accept this critique, but I see its point. It is here where a fine but very important line can be drawn, or should be drawn, between 2 different ways in which we wish to single out and distinct violations against defenders of human rights, and between those and violations against ordinary people, ordinary so-called violations of rights. The more legitimate way to protect a special defense or to discuss it is when the violation of the former, that is, of special institutions and individuals who defend human rights, is seen in continuum and thus is reflecting an extreme case of the violation of rights of the latter, that is, of ordinary, so to speak, individuals. And as a matter concerning the public protection of human rights, rather than the social, as in social networks and social groups, protection of an often otherwise privileged social, often social elite. Anyways, these are the questions and thoughts with which I come to this event tonight. Questions by a somewhat outside observer who's very interested in hearing what more learned and experienced participants in this event have to say. I would like to conclude my remarks by expressing gratitude to all those involved in organizing the event today, and especially to my friend and colleague, Professor Orna Naftali, the Emile Zola Chair of Human Rights, and to the participants of this event, and again to Mr. Michael Forst, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. And now I call Orna to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Shai, for the hospitality offered by the Leer Institute, for the partnership in co-sponsoring this event, and as always. Thank you, Alma and Shari, dear women of the Human Rights Defenders Fund, for initiating and organizing the visit of the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Thank you, Monsieur Michel Frost, for accepting our invitation and for coming here. And thank you all, human rights defenders who are here, for being who you are. The year 2018 will mark the 20th anniversary of I must repeat the name of that resolution, of the UN Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups and Organs of Society to promote and protect universally recognized human rights, fundamental freedoms. These UN resolutions are a mouthful, and this one is generally known as the HRD Declaration. Adopted by the General Assembly by consensus, the resolution includes a list of specific rights of a person or a group or an organization engaged with the defense of human rights. For instance, the right to criticize a government for failing its obligation to respect and ensure human rights. the right to communicate with international bodies, the right to raise funds for the promotion and protection of human rights, and the right to protect human rights defenders from violence, threats, and discrimination. You that may tell a bell or two here in this room. The resolution also established the institution of the Special Rapporteur. It is also, I think, interesting to note that the need to offer human rights defenders a special protection, one that is additional to the general protection human rights law offers to all of us, was acknowledged by the General Assembly in 1998, just a few years before the need became quite urgent, even in countries hitherto not within the usual suspects group. Indeed, a few years before we began witnessing and experiencing something that may well qualify as a paradigmatic shift in the discourse. I think it is hard to deny that the basic notions of human rights, revolving around equal and universal human worth and dignity, protected by the rule of law, grounded in a liberal ethos, and that this ethos is no longer self-evident. It is being pushed off-center. It is being overtaken by the politics of particular identity groups to whom the notion of universal humanity is anathema. Post-human rights discourse, the liberal ethos, the notion of the rule of law, and indeed the center, have been subject to critique left and right for generations, and for some quite good reasons. But I think there is a difference now. And the difference is that the very framework that contains the tension between the universal and the particular, between the human and the citizen, between law and violence, that framework, itself a metaphor for and an expression of the liberal ethos, is cracking. The center, as Yeats wrote in his famous poem, The Second Coming, the second does not hold. It is being overwhelmed, and I think replaced, by the politics of resentment, perhaps spite is a better term here, against its basic tenets. Politics that posit the superiority of a particular nation, ethnos, religion, and all of the above, over equality and human rights, which, by the same token, not merely place human rights defenders and the defensives, but actually stigmatize them as enemies. Think, for instance, of that amalgamated term, lawfare, right? Itself an entry in the lexicon of newspeak for the 21st century. It refers critically to the use of international human rights law and humanitarian law as a means to limit the way states use power. That is, it refers to human rights defenders who use laws which forbid, for instance, the disproportionate use of force, or the harming of civilians, or the transfer of the nationals of an occupying power to the occupied territory. As people who try to limit the state's use of force to defend itself against terrorism, and ergo as supporters of terrorism, and ergo as both terrorists and traitors, they are thus construed as a security threat, as enemies of the people. I'm referring, of course, to people like Thomas in Ibsen's play, when he says, for instance, and I quote, "The whole of our flourishing social life is founded on a lie, and that the source is poisonous." The response by the character called Peter is as follows: "Sheer imagination, or even worse. The man who can make such vile suggestions about his own town is nothing but an enemy of the people." But people like Thomas, and like many of the people gathered here today, are not enemies of the people. The sheer suggestion is a lie. Human rights defenders who find themselves in a position where they themselves they need to be defended against this lie. This is where the institution, the person of the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights Defense, come in. We're happy to welcome you, Monsieur. The floor is yours. Thank you.